Okay, hello everyone. I'm sorry I prepared my presentation in English, so I hope you all follow along with me. Right, so basically what I want to do today is set a bit the tone of what we're going to be talking about in this panel. When we talk about democracy, what do we mean by that? This is a word that we throw around a lot, right? And particularly in Brazil, we're on a crucial moment where democracy is being discussed. It is very important. So what have I prepared here? Basically, I'll start by a very quick overview of the period of the last 30 years, the governments of Fernando Henrique to Dilma, to see some of the conquests that we have achieved then, and what we are today suffering from a disillusionment of democracy. Right. So before going into that, I'm going to give you also a historical background of why democracy is important and the role it has had in Europe, and particularly also in the UK until today. So we're going to look also at historical as well as intellectual perspectives, and we're going to focus on the case of Europe and the UK. And then I'll go back to Brazil for you to understand some of the problems that we are facing today, and also to make that comparison and see how advanced democracies have reached where they have at this particular moment in time. Right, so we all know, and I discussed this in my first book, Journalism and Political Democracy in Brazil, we've had the governments of Cardoso to Lula having been very influential and important, reducing inequality levels, and we had what many people can call a model of consensus, a democratic consensus that was basically in the center, going towards the left or the right in particular periods of Brazilian history. Right, so we had the principles of the Brazilian constitution were being upheld, we had the success of the Real Plan in the 90s, the whole insertion of Brazil within globalization, within the market economy, and also we had a pressuring and an expansion of social welfare programs, particularly programs such as the Bolsa Familia, which has been important worldwide and recognized for reducing inequality. We also saw in these last 3 decades a lot of change going on in Brazilian society, and that has included expansion of less privileged sectors of Brazilian society occupying spaces in the market, in the public sector, including women in businesses, as well as the feminization of politics, women occupying more and more important spaces, from Marina Silva to Heloísa to Dilma, etc. So we had a period which is considered very rich, with a lot of change, right? And also, we are at the moment, especially since 2013, we are in a period of economic recession and uncertainty, right? And the ways in which we can recover this is important. Let's look then at why we are disillusioned after this rich period of democratization that we've had in the last decades. First, we've had this collapse of the model of governability, right? The ways in which not just Dilma, but also Cardoso, etc., had to work within a multi-party system of 35 parties, which led to an excessive fragmentation, and also this idea of co-option and governability, which basically means you have to attend to the interest of many people. A lot of parties which are self-interested and also not necessarily committed to the public good. We also have an ingrained problem of corruption in Brazil, right? Most of you know about this, and we've seen how actually the car wash scandal has pointed out that this is not something particularly now, but has been throughout many governments and many parties. Right, the economic recession is particular to both international influences as well as problems in Brazil that we all know about, including the collapse of the last Lula model, if you want to call it, or this model that has prevailed from the last years, and which has put Brazil in the 3rd year of negative growth. Another problem that we have seen is the ways in which authoritarianism and the legacy that we've had of the dictatorship in terms of the social relations between people and the power relations and the ways in which a particular hierarchy has been constructed in Brazil have persisted. They have not totally diminished. And we have seen this with an increasing political polarization and the ways in which the powerful still have a lot of power and the weak are very vulnerable. Right. This is a problem when we talk about democracy. So one of the things that we've seen as strong sentiment, especially in the last 2 years, is this disillusionment with the whole democratic governance. So not just with Lula or with Dilma, but we have a disillusionment with everyone, all Brazilian politicians. We have a disillusionment with the core institutions, and that includes also sectors of the justice system who have not even them have escaped. Right, so we have then here all this cycle of 15, 20 years somehow for us has come to an end, or we're thinking, where we're going to go from here? What happens? How can we recover what we've had, which was so great? And this particular moment in time is extremely important because we see, for instance, the emergence of strong, extreme politicians such as Bolsonaro emerging to occupy the space, right? And we can also make a link with that with other international trends where far-right parties are also emerging from Donald Trump, and here in Europe as well, there's a lot of concern on that. I'm going to talk about that more shortly. So, to summarize, we see suddenly that our democracy is very fragile. We thought it was stronger, we thought we were moving forward, and suddenly we see this fragility of the precedent system. First and foremost, we see that we have grown used to a particular model in the last decades, and we don't know where that's going to go, right? We see that there are threats posed to the human rights legislation. We see that police brutality has continued. Now, recently we've seen that Reporters Without Borders has pushed actually the Brazil in terms of press freedom has fallen down to 104th position, and one of the things includes also police brutality and repression. Right, we have then the necessity of increasing diversity in the media, which has been important in the last years, but needs to be expanded upon. And I'll talk a bit more about that, but my books also explore that, particularly in relation to the public service broadcasting and comparing to the BBC as well. Right, so then we talk about, let's look at democracy intellectually and historically, as I said in the beginning. Why is this so important? Why are we banging on about this? First, let's look at how Europe has achieved what they are today. This has been a history of long struggles, from the 18th to 19th century, right? We see, for instance, the 18th century with the Industrial Revolution, the workers had hardly any rights, and they had to pressure for that. Charles Dickens has written about that a lot as well. So basically what we have is, throughout the centuries, and particularly also in relation to feminist movements, we had pressure of groups to be represented and included in democratic society. This has been very strong in the 18th and 19th century and have contributed to the formation of the welfare state in European democracies, as well as for their inclusion in public services and for women's rights. Don't have time to go into the literature on democracy, but important things that we need to understand is that liberal democracies have limits, but they have actually been very important in including people, and particularly there is a strong link between this and economic growth. Right, we would not have to, Britain wouldn't be today what it is if it was not for what has happened in the past. And we need to take that into consideration. The 20th century has continued with this. We know the civil rights movement in the US as well, and also a lot of women's groups in the 70s pressuring for women to occupy more important spaces, and today we have women who are in education and also occupying spaces that they didn't have before in the 50s. Right, now, what is this disillusionment with democracy that I've mentioned in the beginning? Right, so there's a lot of literature on this, and I'm going to go very briefly to point out a particular academic called Chantal Mouffe, who wrote The Democratic Paradox, who is particularly critical on this rational model of consensus and deliberative democracy. So her criticism is particularly to the Habermasian public sphere, the rationality which has very much, and I teach about this, I won't be able to go into detail, but basically the model in which we are expanding public debate and including people in the public sphere. And this was developed actually in the 18th and 19th century through capitalism and the press. Right, what she criticizes is also Anthony Giddens' third way model between social democracy and market dynamics. She argues that basically consensus is futile. We cannot think that we're going to compromise in things. There's actually a level of antagonism in politics that cannot be solved. That's her argument. But we see how this is problematic today, this argument, because we are living in a moment that antagonism is having an effect for many democracies in many countries. Right, so this disillusionment with democracy that I told you about is also present in the US, and is also present in Europe as well. We've seen how, for instance, the rise of separatist movements, far-right politics that I talked to you about, right? And even there's a lot of comparison, the ways in which the Brexit is something that extremely about disenfranchisement. Okay, so let's look at the pillars of democracy here that we've had. Right, so Europe has been very much about promotion and protection of human rights, sustainable peace, development and prosperity, equal opportunities, equality acts, European welfare state, market forces, diversity and pluralism in the media. When we come here to this democratic consensus in the UK, we see that they are shared across parties, from the Conservatives, Labour, Liberal Democrats to Greens, as well as many other parties. And what do they include, basically? They include the commitment to equality, to advance democracy. They include a commitment first, for instance, David Cameron recently talked about this, how his party is the party of equality, that their intention is to advance democracy. Right, and this includes legalized gay marriage, parties that introduce Disability Discrimination Act, the gender pay gap. The gender pay gap is extremely important at the moment, and there is a big discussion on this, and particularly Paul Healy, that I interviewed for my current book on gender equality and globalization here, has talked about the importance of this debate. So the idea is to overcome this in the next generation. So this is just for you to see how these democratic values and issues are still important, have marked historically the development of European democracies, and are shared across parties. So it's not a thing of left and right. It's a thing where certain values are considered as very important. This is where we come back to Brazil, where we're talking about the impasse of democracy, where we're in a particular moment where we feel that what is going to happen? Is the economy going to get better? Is there going to be a rise of unemployment? Is this increasing antagonism in politics that I've been talking about, is it going to get worse to the point that there'll be chaos? How are we going to continue to fix on efforts to reduce inequality? How are we going to strengthen democracy? We heard in the last panel people talking about corruption. Is that going to continue? We want that to continue, because that includes good governance, right? So the challenge is that this model of consensus needs to be picked up again. And that is not just between small elite groups, but it is a model that has to be about developing Brazil, about including the diversity of what Brazil is. And that means that many groups that we have seen here, from the pro-impeachment to the anti-impeachment to social movements to students, this is about looking at how we can attend to their interests. I've just given you examples very briefly, because I only have 15 minutes, in terms of how parties, and I could give you about Labour if you wanted as well, have responded to the demands of society. This is what Brazil needs to do. It's not about police brutality or repression of demands. It's about talking to people, dialogue. And that is irrespectively of who is going to be in government in the next. If Dilma returns, if it's new elections, if it's Telma, this is not what is important. What is important is that we need to build a model of development for our country. Right, and that means a better relationship between public and private. That means good governance, less corruption. That means wider participation of civil society. And that means less prejudice, less intolerance, less discrimination. Right, and so we're talking here about a fairer society, more representative. A fairer society with stronger institutions. Also, we're talking about value for money in education and public services. That means we do not want to take out money that goes to education and health services. Even today here in the UK, the Conservatives have a struggle over the NHS. The NHS is the biggest campaign strategy for someone to talk about. It's extremely valued. We want those things, right? We also want to talk about political reform, which should have been done. We want to talk about privatization. Yes, we need to have a serious conversation about that. Why not? Right? What should be privatized, what should not be privatized? But we also need to talk about all these issues which are political issues, and there is a resistance also to talk about them in more detail. We need to talk about also strengthening of human capital. And there's a big debate about tax reform. Should people pay more, who should pay less? We need to talk about that. So this is a particular aspect in terms of recovering this model of consensus and rationality, without the emotion, without extreme polarizations that will only take us more and more further away from what we wanted. We somewhat want to recover the past model, and we want to rebuild on that. We want to rebuild on the mistakes, either from the left or from the right. We want to rebuild and we want to improve.